Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, a stranger rides into town. Certain kinds of story lend themselves to certain archetypal characters, and this has been true for as long as there's been literature. But all too often, the constraints of an archetype actually become a cliche, and so finding new ways to look at classic characters and stories is a continuous challenge for comic artists and writers. So how do you avoid the pitfalls without straying too far from your goals? First, I have an interview with Erin Mehlos of the fantasy western comic Next Town Over. Then, our member Christina Major of the comic Sombulus will join Adam Ma of the comic Folklore, James Nelson of the comic Monsterlands, and Starlia Prichard of the comic Castoff for a discussion of archetypes, stereotypes, and working with both to create new and unique stories. This one may not be what you expect, so stay with us. Hi, I'm Mathieu Moyen, and I make the comic Six Commando. I'll admit it, I love westerns, and one of my favorite comics with a western theme is Erin Mehlos' Next Town Over. Seamlessly mixing, toying with, and subverting the tropes of the western genre, as well as high fantasy, steampunk, and many other styles, Next Town Over is one of the most unique fantasy adventures on my reading list. Erin and I sat down recently to talk about her work, and the fine line between archetypes, stereotypes, and the advantages and pitfalls of using them in her work. Your comic is one that I actually discovered because you bought a very cheap ad on my site, and therefore I sort of clicked through it. And it was this wonderfully rendered, beautifully worked out comic, this sort of spaghetti western that is combined with fantasy and steampunk. And I mean, you're crossing genres so seamlessly. What made you get into that? I mean, there's such interesting and rich areas, all of them in themselves, and yet you've sort of created this one universe that's sort of the nexus of like 5 or 6 of them.
Well, I don't know. I really love classic westerns, spaghetti westerns, the whole myth of the American frontier, but I also really like, more standard fantasy, elves, dwarves kind of thing. But why does it always have to be like a medieval Europe analog? Why not an American West analog? And I mean, the whole concept of just like the frontier and not knowing what's out there and having these unmapped expanses. I don't know. I think that kind of, just that whole ethos, it really dovetails really nice with fantasy, like high fantasy.
That's a very interesting point because there is so much fantasy that falls into these various archetypes of what people expect fantasy to be. Like, okay, it's fantasy, therefore you have to have elves, you have to have kings, you have to have queens, you have to have feudalism and knights and sages. And there are people who subvert that, and there are people who play with that, and there are also people who do straight fantasy in a very successful way. I mean, it's huge right now.
Sure, I love that stuff, but it's like covered.
Well, yeah, but I mean, especially in comics right now too, it's this really huge genre. But then, I've always wondered, is it because the feudal system or like the frame outlook that imposes on a fantasy story creates such easy to understand archetypes?
So at this point, though, the American Western, it practically has its own like fantasy archetypes because, I mean, the whole concept of like, the bounty hunter, the cowboy in white who defends the town. It's got its own tropes, and some of those you can like directly link. I mean, I don't want to turn this into a plug for my Patreon, but I've got a patron only comic that is like, it's like a sister comic to Next Town Over, and I'm playing more directly with, the American Western and Western fantasy. I've got a main character who's like, he's supposed to be a paladin very much, but, he's also got a pistol, but he's got a white horse, and he often fights in close quarters. And then I've got a healer, because you gotta have a complete party trinity, and I've got a DPS.
To what extent do you think that limits you, or do you think that is something that is, do you think that starting from there has helped you, or do you think that it is something that you're trying to get away from, or is it something that you're deliberately playing too?
So when I started doing Next Town Over, well, it's got a weird kind of inception story, which was just that at the time my sister was writing a story where she had all these bystanders in towns, and she had 2 protagonists that were, I mean, does this sound familiar? Stop me if you've heard this one. She had 2 protagonists that were moving from town to town, wrecking the joint with zero exploration of the collateral damage that they were causing. the towns didn't even have names. She was just referring to them as the next town over. This is where this all started. And I was deep into my Western phase anyway. And I was like, well, let's do something with that. Like, so if you have these so the characters in my comic, they're almost like super powered, right? I mean, would they care? Like, what is their interactions with these towns when they're just focused on each other? And it's maybe even a bit ham-fisted, but it was like, how many tropey things can I subvert per character? So like, I mean, the one guy, John Henry Hunter, he's a spellcaster, but he's a physically pretty big guy. He's not like a fragile glass cannon type of a spellcaster. He's also the guy in white, but at the same time, like right from the very first pages of the comic, I tried to make him like ridiculously stereotypically the villain. Like even his beard, he looks like a mustache twirling, tired to the train tracks type of a villain.
That's true. I mean, he does. Then you have the man in black who I think at one point I commented is basically Lee Van Cleef.
Yeah, I do a lot of like visual references to Westerns that I like, and there's a pretty straight up visual nod to the three lead characters in, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with those three.
Well, I mean, they're in all of the really classic ones. The Good, Bad, the Ugly,
right.
The Few Dollars More,
Sure.
Fistful of Dollars.
Right.
And yet, all the best American Westerns, the really, really good, solid American Westerns, were made by an Italian and filmed in Spain.
Well, like, so Leone's movies, they don't really have, like, a white hat in the old Western sense. Clint Eastwood's, like, Man with No Name character, he's kind of chaotic neutral.
Yet another archetype to look into, like the 9 basic character types. I mean,
right.
There is no lawful good character in the modern Western.
No. Yeah, I mean, like in the first movie, and then of course, the first movie is itself a redo of a samurai film.
That's right.
This gets very culturally mixed up, like the deeper you go, but I mean, he's a mercenary pitting a group of outlaws against basically another group of outlaws.
That's true. Which leads me to ask you another question. What do you think happens when that goes too far? Or perhaps to phrase it another way, there's a very fine line between cultural cross-pollination and cultural appropriation, which is sort of one of the buzzwords of the moment now. I'm not 100% sure I know exactly what people mean by cultural appropriation when they say it. I mean, I get the intent behind it.
Right.
Like, where's the line? Is there a line between using a culture as inspiration and using it as set dressing?
I mean, I guess that's one of the reasons that I'm maybe the most comfortable writing about something that's largely informed by, the American frontier myth, because I am American. So like, spoilers, I plan to eventually get into maybe some like, equivalents of indigenous people in Next Town Over, and I'm actually a little afraid of that because they're not Native American people. I can't make them Native American people. I don't want to get into that really, but I'm afraid that that's going to be, people are automatically going to draw that conclusion about it. And that's why I didn't want to deal with Next Town Over's indigenous people analog too heavily, because I don't know that I'm qualified to do that. Like, I've done a bit of research on Native myth to inform what I'm going to do, but I really don't want to like kick over the rock of people's living culture when doing my comic.
That's an important thing to be sensitive to, obviously.
Yeah.
Do you think that you have to be of a thing in order to write about it in that way?
I don't know. That's something that I've grappled with a lot. Like, I want to try to be inclusive with comics, and I had this conversation with a number of different people, like a lot of white people, obviously, and then like, I'm white, I should throw that out there. And then like, some people of color and others, and I've come back to that a lot. Like, I want to be inclusive and representative, and for my part, I think that's fine as long as you don't try to get into the actual experience of dealing with what comes with being those people. I put that really badly.
No, I think I understand what you mean. I mean,
right.
The difference between writing about and pretending to know from the inside.
I want to have black characters in my books because, I mean, I am doing a fantasy story in which I didn't put a history of slavery because I think that's the fantasy I would like to have. I don't necessarily need an analog for slavery because it wasn't something I'm culturally too proud of. So, like, divorced from that, I want to have people of color in my comic, and I'm comfortable with that, but I don't obviously want to dig into what it means to be a person of color with my fantasy Western webcomic.
Well, yet another reason perhaps that people do gravitate towards fantasy, because it's easy to romanticize the medieval period, but it's also easy to sort of wash your hands of it when it's doing things that you don't really want to do, because everybody can agree that things that happened in the Dark Ages are things that we don't want to have happen again. Like wars of religion, not good.
Right.
The Renaissance, pretty good.
Well, yeah, so that's like just gets back to what I was saying with, it's nice to not have to engage with something as ugly as like slavery and a civil war born of slavery. So I just kind of didn't do that. I kind of combined the NTO-niverse. I kind of combined its independence with the time period that, that would have been our Civil War.
Well, it's the High West.
Right. It's exactly.
One can have the High Middle Ages, but one can also have the High West.
Yep.
To go back to sort of think more generally about the archetype versus the stereotype, where do you think that line is? Do you think it exists? How do you draw that line when you're creating or compiling characters for Next Town Over, for example?
Next Town Over doesn't have a lot of characters. And when it does have new characters, I have frequently tried to make them allusions to Westerns that I like. Because they're barely there, right? The bystanders in Next Town Over so far have basically just been bystanders. The main two, I wanted to like present them as stereotypes, but then over time maybe peel it back. I wanted to make a stereotype and then work backwards and make something where, viewed from another angle, the characters maybe looked more complicated than they originally appeared. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's been the best way to get readers, because I think people might see that stereotype presentation and be off-put before they stick around and see me try to add that extra dimension.
I've found on a number of occasions that people who set out to write a certain kind of story may not be as successful because they are setting out to write a certain kind of story and fall into the traps of loading it down with all of the things that, of course, that kind of story has to have.
Yeah. And
you seem to me to have done that, and yet done so successfully. And that mystifies me about Next Town Over. I mean, you've been able to tread that line, to engage with that really fine, that very narrow gray area between the archetype and the stereotype, between, of course, a Western has to have the black hat, of course there have to be horses and all of the trappings of the Western, and yet it's a Western, but it's not. It has the things that a Western has, but it subverts them in increasingly subtle ways as you read it.
Well, thank you. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said.
I don't know if it's the nicest thing anyone's ever said, but how do you tread that line? And you mentioned that you feel like it may have cost you readers. Do you think it's worth that to really explore something like that from an angle that is unique in the way that Next Town Over is?
I mean, I don't know. So I've been drawing it for so long now because I'm really slow at drawing comics, but I don't think that I would do this comic again in the way that I did if I were to start it now today. Like, this is a comic I came up with when I was in my 20s, and now I'm hurtling towards 40. I don't have a good answer for, like, how do I do it? I mean, I mentioned earlier that I was playing with an accidental idea of my sister's that was, in her thing, a terrible pitfall of what she was trying to do. I thought it would be fun to play with it. And that's all I've done with any of it, is it's like, this is a thing that happens in this movie, but what if instead of being this thing, it was this other thing? And I mushed a bunch of those together.
I don't know if you're giving yourself enough credit there. I mean, it's more than that. I don't know.
Have you ever read The Virginian?
I have read The Virginian, and there's the great movie based on it as well.
Sure. Like seminal piece of Western literature. The ending of that book, it doesn't sit well with me because, she gives him that ultimatum of, if you have this duel with this guy, we're donezo because I don't want you to do this. And he's like, well, whatever, I guess then we're donezo because I gotta fight this guy. And he goes and he fights the guy, and you think, like, that's awesome. He's willing to make this call, and he chooses his honor over this woman. But then she takes him back, so it wasn't really a choice. She's like, oh, I couldn't bear to see you endangered in that way, and I'm sorry. Let's please get married after all. I've always hated that about the Virginian, because I think it would be so much more interesting if she said, no, I said we're donezo. And so, like, if I was gonna do my take on the Virginian, he would absolutely not get back together with her. And that's how I approach everything. That's my writing process, is change the end of the Virginian. I don't know, it's like sometimes you can see this work has a really good idea, but for me it would say something more interesting if it went in this other direction.
Welcome, everyone. We just had a great interview discussion, and we were all excited about that. So here we are, ready to talk about some of the things that go down when you're writing a story and trying to come up with genres and tropes and all that good stuff. I am Christina Major, the creator of Sombulus, and I am here with Starlia Prichard, creator of Castoff.
Hello.
James Nelson, creator of Monsterlands.
Hi there.
And Adam Ma, creator of Folklore.
Hey there.
Today we're kind of talking about the expectations that people bring to your comic. Do you think people come to your comic with expectations of it being a certain brand of fantasy or superhero or manga or whatever you do? What do you guys think?
With Monsterlands, my webcomic, I definitely feel people do expect sort of a lighthearted, like, humorous fantasy story, because I do, like, set it up as that in the first couple of pages, but later on it sort of subverts that it sort of digs more into the characters and the environment than the reader might be initially led to think it would.
Yeah, I like how it really deals with the cliche high fantasy tropes that you're sort of used to, but it's very clear that it has a sense of humor from the get-go. And then it almost like, it kind of goes in the other direction. It's like, whoa, maybe there's more to these characters when you dig into the surface. And I really like that about your comic. What about you, Star? What do you think people are coming to Castoff to see?
Well, my elevator pitch is it's glowy children with problems. So hopefully they expect that because that's what they're getting. But I feel like with any fantasy story, you hear fantasy and a lot of people, their first thought is stuff like Lord of the Rings, where it's very like epic high fantasy. It's like, wizards and elves and magic. Wow.
Yes.
I consider Castoff. So if Lord of the Rings is high fantasy, I kind of consider my comic low fantasy, if that doesn't sound too weird. It's like, it's got magic and stuff, but it doesn't take itself too seriously, I think.
I almost feel like, and this is something that I feel with Sombulus, I was never really into a lot of Lord of the Rings type of fantasy stuff growing up, but I was into anime and manga, and I feel like that's more of the tropes that people come to me expecting, because I have these characters, they have these wings, and I draw in a very anime reminiscent style, so yeah, and I feel like those are the tropes and expectations that people come to Sombulus for. And then, Adam, you just do a superhero. There's all kinds of things that people bring to superhero comics. I mean, what do you think about that? Are people coming to Folklore expecting that?
I don't think so, no. I think part of that is that we're not quite superhero and we're not quite horror or post-apocalyptic. So I think I wouldn't say we struggle to find an audience per se, because we've had a lot of readers and we've had an amazing past couple of years just getting new readers and people into it. But I definitely think that readers want to approach a specific story with a firm idea of what the genre is. And I think for Monsterlands and Castoff especially, even if you're not into high fantasy or low fantasy or fantasy with humor, knowing that it's fantasy, you have an expectation of like, oh, there's going to be magic or there's going to be something magical or fantastical. And as long as it meets that criteria, you're okay. But horror tends to be all over the place. Like you could have some really, really brutal, violent stuff, or you could have something that's more psychological. And the same with superheroes. You could have some down-to-earth stories or something more like hopeful, like Justice League or something. And I think not being really clearly in with one foot in the other genre-wise, a lot of readers are not quite sure where to go with Folklore. At least until they're a little bit into it.
Yeah, it definitely sets up the story in this way, and I remember reading the intro, I'm like, oh, I know where this is going, and then all of a sudden, I do not know where this is going. This is like, oh my gosh.
I mean, that's the best kind of story, though, is the kind that sets you up for something and then kind of flips your expectations so that you can't really predict where it's gonna go.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you go into a story expecting one thing and it delivers on exactly what you expect, is like, oh, this guy's the bad guy, this guy's gonna come in and save the day at the last second, and everyone's gonna live happily ever after. There's a certain amount of satisfaction with that, because it's like, oh, I know exactly where this is going. And that's it's a comfort zone thing, I think. But personally, I find it more interesting when a story can take my expectations and kind of just throw them out the window and be like, hey, this isn't going to be like those other stories you've read.
Oh, absolutely.
That's what gets me excited, is like, yes, I have no idea what's going to happen. Hit me with that good story. Let's go. I'm ready for it.
Yes. Yeah, I like that too. I mean, I set up these characters that are kind of angel demon analogs, and I want you to come in with certain assumptions about angels or demons or whatever, so I can break those assumptions, and so I always have a lot of fun with that.
I think it is interesting about how a lot of our work relies on previously established works because we want those expectations to be built up.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely a common theme with our work in general. I think a lot of Spiderforest work is starting off in one kind of trope or trope-filled world or land and then subverting that heavily. I think a lot of our authors do that. It's really cool.
Yeah, we've got a good collection of people, and it's just also in terms of just standing out from the crowd, there's so many webcomics out there, and it's hard to tell what to read and what you're gonna spend your time on. It's almost a long-term commitment when you follow a long-form story, and it's refreshing. It's nice to be able to say, okay, I'm offering something a little different here, and get your hooks into them. I always find that fun. What do you guys think were your influences, that most play into your genre or those tropes? Do you have any nods to the popular tropes of your genre or?
Yeah, so I remember you said a few minutes ago how your story was more, rather than Lord of the Rings style fantasy, you were more influenced by anime. Castoff is definitely the same way. I can point to any number of things and be like, you see that? I wrote that after watching this show. Because I love it. I certainly have a certain set of tropes that I adore. Mm-hmm. I can give a specific example. It's not technically anime, but Avatar: The Last Airbender, I remember I was watching the director's commentary, and they talked about how for Azula and Zuko, when they were fighting, they made Azula's fire blue so that when they got into confrontations, you could tell whose fire was who.
Yeah.
And that is literally the entire reason why everyone in my comic has a different color for their magic. Mm-hmm. Because I wanted to be able to use it for fight sequences and also have characters associated with this color so I can use that kind of in the visual sense. Give me a rainbow cast of characters so that I can make them fight.
Yeah, that's really cool.
James, you have a lot of stuff in Monsterlands. The fun villainous headdress and
oh, yeah.
people with armor, and it really has the trappings of the fun D&D adventure. I kind of like that. Do people ask you if it's your D&D group? Because I get that all the time.
Yeah, I've gotten definitely a good deal of comments asking it was about a D&D adventure that I played with my friends. The answer is no, because I actually fall asleep during those games.
No.
I'm a horrible D&D player.
Oh.
Just make that canon. Make a character who just constantly falls asleep, and then the party has to work around it.
Yeah, you're always napping.
That would be good. That's Snorlax right there.
Yep.
But in terms of inspirations, the antagonist Erin, her headdress is pretty clear callback to Maleficent, mm-hmm. and just it's just a very evil looking outfit, things like that. And two of my big inspirations in terms of writing are the old Transformers and G.I. Joe cartoons, just cause This may sound weird. They're not really written well, but they are made to just sell toys. So the dialogue is just there in service of moving it along as efficiently as possible. And that is something that is like, well, those older cartoons are pretty antiquated and, compared to cartoons of today, the writing isn't nearly as good, but there is sort of a purpose of dialogue there that I did appreciate. So I tried to sort of adapt that to more modern storytelling methods.
Adam, what do you think goes into folklore? What are you calling on when you come up with that?
I know that when I first started trying to come up with a project for Colin and I to work on, I kind of realized that there was no real horror comic that I was aware of at the time. Maybe there is, maybe there was a real superhero based comic that talked about what these people who were basically invincible and fought asteroids and planet killing interdimensional space monsters, what they were actually afraid of. And I think comics have become a lot smarter. Mainstream and indie comics have become a lot smarter in the past few years. We've seen a lot of superhero deconstruction, probably because of all of the superhero movies that are out there. But that was a main driving force, is to try to approach what did someone with unlimited power, what would they fear, and how would their fears reflect on regular people who can't lift buildings or fly or do these amazing things.
Yeah, and then it really starts to take on a more psychological aspect and just get into, if I'm all powerful and I can't face this, what happens?
Yeah, exactly. We don't often see the results of a terrible superhero decision unless it's going to be in some sort of a huge arcing storyline like Flashpoint or any of the major superhero events like Civil War, right? Where their fears become so blown out of proportion that it needs a huge marketing event to handle. But I think it's way more interesting to kind of see what's going on day to day, when there's not a big event or when there's some huge occurrence, and Folklore I think focuses on the aftermath of that. So we wanted to really dig into superheroes as normal people more than anything else, not heroic individuals, but who they are as a person.
Yeah, it really works, and it really draws out kind of whole dynamic between people who have power and people who don't, and maybe there's a line there where finally they can see eye to eye after all of this infighting. What about you, Star? Are you what kinds of tropes did you look at in the fantasy genre or even manga and anime that you said, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to destroy that with my face?
That leads into an interesting conversation I've had with lots of people. I get a lot of, not blowback necessarily, but I get a lot of friends giving me grief because whenever they ask me, is Star, you hate fantasy. Why are you writing a fantasy comic? Why is this what you're spending so much time and effort on? And the truth is, I don't hate fantasy, I just hate a lot of the tropes that kind of come alongside, generic fantasy stuff. Mm-hmm. American fantasy, at least, English fantasy. Anime and stuff is a little bit more free, I think, and there's a lot more, interesting things, and also it's generally more colorful a lot of the times. When I think English fantasy, I think of, Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Stuff like that, I just could never get into. And I have so many friends who are so deep into those franchises, and I tried. I really did. But everyone has 9 different names, is I am this guy, son of this person and this person, and I'm just tell me your name. I don't care. And I think the other thing, this became prevalent when I tried to play Dragon Age a few years ago. One of my biggest pet peeves in fantasy is when the world outshines the characters. So you have this immense world and there's cities and societies and it's so interesting and you have all this political drama. I'm I don't care. Show me how this affects an interesting character and then I will start caring about how many kings you've had in your thousands of civilizations. I don't care unless you show me how it relates to a character I can root for. And so I think when I was writing Castoff, I went with, what kind of fantasy do I want to read? Mm-hmm. And so I was you will learn about the world building when you need to know about it. And I want everything to be glowy and shiny and rainbow sparkly because that's the anime influence coming through again. But I have this whole fantasy rant and I'm not going to do it right now, but you basically just got the truncated version of it. It's just like, I have a lot of tropes in your average fantasy story that I cannot stand. And so I actively worked against it. It's like, okay, here's a list of things I don't like, so let's aggressively push those off the desk and do something else.
It's like a cat with a water cup, and the water cup is full of all the tropes that you hate. You just like,
yes,
fill it up.
And just gonna pick it up and take it to the sink and pour it down the drain, because I can't get...
But that is interesting, just taking a more human element to fantasy is interesting, because I feel like for Sombulus I get a lot of people who might be asking about the world or how magic works or all that stuff that I'm like, I'm not gonna sit down and write this out for you.
Yeah, I get that a lot too, specifically because like it's the kind of thing where you will get world building when you need to know it. I'll drop hints if it's something important, and then maybe later I'll add exposition if it really needs it. But for the most part, you really don't. It's just like, this is how the world works. I don't need to sit there and give you paragraphs, because my audience, you guys are smart enough to figure it out. And if you can't figure out exactly what it is, don't worry about it. You don't need to know how the economics of fishing works in this world if it's never going to come up in the story.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of fantasy is like, oh, and this is how the economics of fishing work. And I'm like, I don't care unless the main character goes fishing for their job.
So it's almost like the trope that you are subverting is like the whole approach to fantasy altogether.
I just don't see the point of writing all of this stuff if it's never going to come up in the story. I am very much more interested in how characters interact with each other within the world than I am with how the world interacts with itself. Because you can't make the world cry.
You just want to make people cry. I see how it is.
I do. It's true. I'm not sorry about it.
What about you, James? Did you go into Monsterlands wanting to subvert some tropes, or...
I suppose I wanted to sort of like a lot of fantasy comics, you see sort of the ultimate good or the ultimate evil, or sort of these systems in place, and they sort of will give vague explanations of how they came about, but maybe not go too far into the more human element of how these things came about. It's very Lord of the Ringsy when you get like a villain character, like say Sauron, and it's, he craved power because he wanted everyone to obey the law, but then he craved too much power, so he became evil, and that's like a perfectly suitable origin story. Oh yeah, and then he has some orcs or something. I watched the stuff. I know the things. But I wanted to go into more of like the, sort of like, what does Sauron do when there's nothing going on? What's his day-to-day like? Who does he talk to? Who's he Skyping?
He gives his dragon belly rubs.
Yeah, I just wanted to see, in small actions, you can find things that reveal information about bigger actions, I find. The devil is in the details, so to speak. And yeah, I just wanted to sort of add a bit more of a, like, relatable human element to my fantasy story, where it's like Destructor is a Conan-esque, like, barbarian guy who can punch through walls. But the main, like, crux of his character is that he really wants attention. Yeah, he wants people to think he's cool, and he'll do whatever he can do to make people think that. And readers may not be able to identify with that personally, but they can probably, like, recall a point in their life where they might have met someone like that. And I think that's sort of, as long as it's relatable to, real life through the fantasy, if you can see some element of your life in there. I think that's something I wanted to nail, writing-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has felt that kind of craving for attention. Maybe they're not punching through walls to do it.
They should be.
The wall is a metaphor.
That's the best way to get attention, I find. Punching stuff.
Man, you punch enough stuff, you'll get attention.
It's true. I mean, if you've read Monsterlands, that's exactly what happens. You do get attention.
His arc is he learns to punch the right people, and then he gets the good attention.
Strategic punching. I see.
So you can kind of play to these archetypes and stereotypes. Where's the line between them? Like, is it important to, cause it can get harmful if you're playing to especially old fantasy tropes and things where you're not 100% sure where they came from. Maybe they came from a harmful place to other people. where do you draw that line? How do you avoid that sort of thing?
Well, there's a fine line between referencing something and wholeheartedly embracing something and just repeating it, and I think that's where some people seem to miss the mark. It's one of those things where I can't think of any like specific examples. It's just sort of a I know it when I see it basis of like commentary on something is not necessarily the same as just repeating something. That's my angle.
Yeah, I think that it's very possible to have all these influences and kind of just regurgitate them instead of try to make something new with them.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Fantasy, I think, is a little looser in terms of like what you can or cannot do to avoid a trope. But horror is really easy, right? Like just you have the final girl, right? So the one who survives till the end, and you have the smart guy who figures everything out, and the dumb jock, and not just slashers, but like in general, horror is filled with a lot of tropes. So one thing we do whenever we're designing a new character or introducing a new character, it started out with just a concern that we didn't have enough strong female leads. We just asked, could this character be a girl? Could this character be Hispanic, or should this character be smarter or, even dumber? What kind of job should they have? And a lot of the times that we approach character design by just creating the character we first want and then theorizing what the character could potentially be instead, we come up with someone who's a little more diverse and a little more realistic, and maybe not necessarily someone you would expect in a horror-themed comic or even a superhero comic. Someone who you're used to seeing a certain type of hero or a certain type of villain. I know that there's a villain that's coming up in a couple issues that was a totally different like gender, nationality, and all this other stuff that they were originally written as. And it just ended up being really predictable. So once we started asking those questions, you just end up making something that's a little bit more true to heart.
Yeah, it's important. It's important to kind of stop and ask those questions. I mean, I know for Sombulus, I was just regurgitating what I saw with anime, and everybody in anime was pretty and white, and so that's what I drew. And then like I kind of stopped and I'm like, I live in Los Angeles. I live in a very diverse area, and these characters that I'm drawing look nothing like my friends or neighbors or anybody I know. I mean, everybody's a little bit of something, and here I have this very white, bland cast. So there was kind of a turning point for me in the middle of the story where I'm like, okay, all the other characters, we're gonna try to figure out exactly what you said, Adam. What else could they be? What else makes sense here, and get a little more representation in?
That was something I did with Castoff as well. I remember, so somewhere in the nether sphere of the internet is my old DeviantArt account, and so I have old concepts for these characters. It was kind of the same thing, where like, with the exception of Vector, who's always looked pretty much the same, all of my other characters were like pretty and white and blonde. I went back and I was looking at my character cast like a couple years after I drew like this ensemble cast image, and I was like, is this really boring?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and so like I went around, I like kind of played with my characters a bit, I like adjusted a lot of things. So my cast was smaller back then, and I did like make a bunch of new characters to just like kind of fill into different places. And I was just like, yeah, let's have some fun with this, let's have some fun with this. Not even to like make a statement, just to like have a more interesting ensemble of characters. Because there was a point where literally, like, all of the female characters were blonde and pretty, and I'm like, people are gonna have a hard time telling them apart, and also this is boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I do the thing with the cat and the glass on the table again, and just like, okay, let's push this over here, and do something else.
I'm probably guilty of complaining about anime a lot and its influence on the comic industry. And I say it as someone who loves anime. I literally watch anime and read manga all the time. I've done so since I was little. Like it's been a big influence in getting me into all kinds of genres. So I do love anime, but I think that anime is guilty of being a little isolationist.
Yeah.
You have to work really hard to find an anime with a black person who isn't, a racist caricature. And you have to work even harder to find a Latino. They're just not interested in it because it's not catered to Japanese society. They're not guilty of being racist per se. It's just, that's their world, right? So when it comes over to us and we live in really diverse global culture, it's okay to reach a little bit beyond what anime has gotten you into and to maybe reflect your world a little bit more. If your world is just 100% white elves and it's like a General Hospital style drama, then, by all means go for it. But I think it's much better to see the world we live in reflected in some way in your world too.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. Any other advice you would have for people who are just starting out, trying to make a comic and worrying about if they're being too tropey, if they're not being tropey enough, or...
I mean, the one thing I would say is that I feel like, especially recently, there's kind of been a negative connotation with the word trope. I've saw a few people who saw that, like, having a TV tropes made of their work is a giant insult because it's like, oh, you did this thing and you did this thing and you did this thing. You're not original.
Oh, yeah.
And that is complete nonsense. Trope is just like another word for like a pattern. It's a pattern in storytelling, and they're not inherently bad. It's how you use them. I mean, like, I have a TV tropes page, and it's just like, this character has glowy eyes. That's the thing that happens. And I'm like, yes, because I love glowing eyes. And so that's like one of my biggest things is like, if you have something that you love, just run with it, man. Like, don't worry about what people are going to say because it's not about the people. It's about you. You're the one putting all the work into it. It should be something that you unabashedly love with all your heart. If that means putting in all your favorite tropes, then do it. If that means subverting all your favorite tropes, then do it. I mean, don't put so much effort into creating something, I guess, that is going out of its way to go against tropes, but just do something that you're gonna love, because people will find you through that. And, like, if you're passionate about it, it will show.
Yeah, I think you make a valid point. You shouldn't be too concerned if people find certain patterns in your work or, narrative devices or whatever, because, we live in an age where our cinematic language and our narrative language is more developed than it ever has been, because we have so much prior works to draw inspiration from. And of course, the same can be said for each following year. That will only get more and more true. So you really should not be ashamed to draw inspiration from things you found successful, because there is a reason those things were successful, because on some level they must have worked. And no shame. TV tropes is just more of a catalog. It's not an indictment of anything.
I totally agree. Like, tropes exist for a reason, and they're very successful for a reason. But just because you're leaning on a trope, or because you've included one intentionally or otherwise, sometimes you write a character and you don't even realize that you've created some sort of an archetype that everyone else identifies. Whatever the reason that they're involved in your story, you don't need to worry about it. As long as the story is compelling, you can tell the classic hero story arc of redemption a million different ways, and depending on the type of person, what their motivations are, what their background is, what the world is, you're telling a completely different story every single time, even if the redemption story arc never really changes. Worry about your characters, worry about what sort of interactions they have, worry about their adventures, and if you find what you're doing is fun and compelling and you want to keep on doing it, you've probably hit something. You're on the right track, so don't worry about if it's similar to something else. It'll stand on its own as long as you're really into it. Your audience, your readers, they'll be into it too.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our director, our showrunner, and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support. To learn more about the collective, our members, and our projects, or to make a donation, go to spiderforest.com. I'd like to thank Erin Mehlos for joining us for this episode. You can read her comic Next Town Over at nexttownover.com. I'd also like to thank Christina Major for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as Adam Ma, James Nelson, and Starlia Prichard for participating. Christina makes the comic Sombulus. You can read it at sombulus.com. Adam creates the comic Folklore. You can read it at folklorecomic.com. James creates the comic Monsterlands. You can read it at monster-lands.com. Star creates the comic Castoff. You can read it at castoff-comic.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.